Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll do some quick introductions and take care of a few housekeeping items. I'm Jessie Bieringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Joining me to discuss leadership development is 3D Group Senior Consultant Charles Gerhold. Charles has over 20 years of consulting and business experience, serving clients from a wide variety of industries across North America, Latin America, and Europe. As a consultant, his work is focused primarily on leadership development, organizational effectiveness, executive coaching, strategic HR alignment, and succession management. Charles has also held internal business unit leadership and human resources roles, including leading the North American Human Capital Consulting business for Hudson Consulting and leading global talent management and acquisition for Scott's Miracle-Gro. Charles has a master's in IO psychology from the University of Tulsa. So please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation using the chat box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll be answering as many of your questions as we can at the end. Thank you all for joining us today for Bridging the Leadership Gaps, Strategies to Develop Your Leaders. Charles, I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Great. Thanks, Jessie, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm excited to be with everyone today. Today we're going to talk about the growing challenge of leadership development and bridging the leadership gaps. The growing challenge of leadership really means that leadership development is more important than ever, and it also means that it's more challenging than ever. There are billions of dollars spent every year on leadership development. Research by Bernstein by Deloitte in 2014 showed that there was $12 billion spent on leadership development in the U.S. alone that year. Last year, the spend on training and development as a whole increased by 27%. So that means that's good because we are wanted and desired in what we do. It also means that we have some real significant challenges for us and some great opportunities. Basically, the leadership gap, what we mean by that is the lack of ready now leaders to promote or hire in at a certain point. Promoting leaders and hiring people in is a risk. So today we're really going to talk about what is driving the challenge, the barriers to success of leadership development, and some ideas to overcome those challenges. But before we dig into the conversation, let's take a look at what CEOs are saying about the need for leadership development. These are those things the CEOs with human resources and beyond that say that those things are keeping them up at night. And you can see that human capital is a primary concern of CEOs of organizations of all sizes. A primary concern, like I said, is that human capital. CEOs recognize that without the right leaders in place, even the best strategies will fail. CEOs also see hiring outside leaders as risky. It's better to develop leaders from inside who understand the culture and have existing networks. And CEOs agree on 4 things are needed to improve the state of human capital in organizations. The first is the need to enhance the effectiveness of senior leadership teams. Developing those folks at the very top of the organization. The second is improve the effectiveness of leadership development programs, making sure that those $12 billion that are spent on leadership development programs have the right impact on the organization. A third need for human capital in organizations is that leaders are able to drive employee engagement at all levels of the organization. And the fourth one is to create an entrepreneurial culture that is more embracing of risks. And you can see that from this graphic here, we want to highlight that there are different levels of leadership gaps. These are 4 that we will talk about here, but the leadership gaps in every organization are different. It can be these common levels or the ones that are unique to the organization and the industry. But it's important to know that CEOs see the leadership gap at every level. So what is driving this leadership gap and this need for increased leadership development? we see that there are three converging forces that are creating kind of this perfect storm. There's generational dynamics, there's operational realities, and there's the culture drivers in the culture that are creating a perfect storm to make leadership more challenging and more difficult now than it ever has been. So we're going to take a minute and dig into these. So one of the first generational things to think about is what's called the silver tsunami. Baby boomers used to be the largest generation in the workforce. The first baby boomers turned 65 in 2011, and since then, 10,000 baby boomers have left the workforce every day. When I was getting ready for this webinar and researching, I found that number, and I had to double-check it in two different places. I can't believe it. But it's an amazing number that 10,000 people leave the workforce every day from baby boomer generation. And this is creating a huge void of human capital, including leaders. We're losing senior leaders, seasoned leaders who are hard to replace. So other generational pressures and realities that we see is that millennials now make up the majority or the largest group in the workforce. In 2015, they surpassed Gen X as the largest group in the workforce. So other interesting things about millennials is that they're not kids anymore. The youngest millennials turned 21 this year, and the oldest are turning 37. This means that the millennials are all old enough to drink, and some of them are pushing middle age. And so the upside to this, with the silver tsunami and all of those baby boomers leaving, we have a gigantic generation with lots of people coming into the workforce. And this generation has some really unique things about them. First generation in the United States where minorities will become the majority of the population. So cultural awareness, the ability to work across cultures and within cultures is growing. It's the most educated generation ever. This generation not only is the best educated ever, they also are able to learn and relearn, and we're taught to learn in a less hierarchical and more collaborative manner, which really seems to fit what's happening in modern corporate America, with organizations being flatter, more matrix, and requiring more agility and more collaboration. Millennials are used to technology. They've had it their whole lives. It's not new. It is just normal. It's not intimidating. It's not awkward. They understand how to use it. They understand how to adapt with it, and they understand how to get the most out of it. And one knock on millennials is that they have been seen as willing to leave and willing to job hop more than previous generations. But when you look at the data, this just isn't true. When you look at young workers between 22 and 29 in 1995, they voluntarily turned over at a rate of about 4.5% a year. When we look at young workers in 2014 between the ages of 22 and 29, so that would be millennials compared to Gen Xers before, they turn over voluntarily at 3% a year. So that means that millennials actually turn over 1/3 less voluntarily than Gen Xers do. So we have a group that is highly educated, culturally diverse, able to work with technology, and when we invest those billions of dollars in leadership development, they're more likely to stick around and allow us to see the fruits of those labors. Another converging force that's making leadership and leadership development harder is just the operational reality of business today. We can hear this called VUCA. The world is getting more complex, work is getting more complex, and leading is getting harder and harder. So thinking about what's changing for leaders and the work that they have to do, the velocity is picking up. Things happen, the frequency of change, the rapidity, significant changes is more common and faster. There's more uncertainty in the world. The outcomes are less predictable of what we are doing. Complexity is growing. The interconnectedness of issues and data and systems is growing greater and greater and more confusing and more complex every day. And this is all creating just a lot of ambiguity, a lack of clarity. What is the situation today is harder to understand, and what is the situation going to be tomorrow adaptable, be faster and better critical thinkers, agile learners, willing and able to embrace risk and then tolerate, at the end of the day, a lot of ambiguity. The last converging force that we want to talk about today is the growing diversity. The world is getting smaller and smaller and more diverse, at least the world of work is. Women only represent 16% of executive teams, and the non-white population only represents 3% of executive teams in the United States. And there are some certain obvious worries about that. And one of them is when you look at the effectiveness of organizations that lack diversity at the executive level. Those organizations that have more diverse senior teams outperform organizations with a lack of diversity, whether that diversity is gender, whether it's ethnicity, or a combination of the two. So the bottom line is this opportunity to promote more folks to develop and promote more folks into the senior level will help us perform at a higher level. So now that we've looked at the forces that are creating these leadership gaps, let's take a moment to take a look at the common barriers that can derail the effectiveness of the leadership development programs we put in place. We've identified 4 common barriers that can derail your leadership development programs. And the first is context. That is the content really tied to what the business needs from a strategic and a leadership development and leadership skill standpoint? The decoupling of the activity within the development program are the activities that we're asking our leaders to do to grow and change their behavior actually seen as related and relevant to the work? We're going to talk a little bit about mindsets. So there are 2 different mindsets to think about here. The organizational mindset. So is the organization really ready for the change that it's asking for, and what can we do to help enable that readiness? And then the individual. What's the individual's mindset? Are they ready to accept the change? Do they really understand themselves, and do they understand kind of the why behind the what of their behavior? And the last barrier is all about measurement and metrics, and that goes back and really loops back to the first one of context. We define in the context what we need. We should define what that impact would be, and that turns into our metrics of what the impact of our leadership development programs have. So some considerations to help overcome these barriers. So again, from a context, it's defining the specific needs tied to the operational realities of the business and the strategy. So what are those new skills and behaviors that leaders need to operate in the world of VUCA, in the changing industry that they work in? And do they have the skills and the behavior to execute the strategy that your organization has? Some tips here is to keep it really simple, to keep it focused. Don't create models that are overly complex or really disengage from what the reality is of what a leader needs to be successful. What are those 2 or 3 things that a leader needs to focus on to be successful in the context of their role or the role that they're going to move into in your organization, in the complexity of your organization and your business? So the next barrier that we talked about was the decoupling, making sure that the training and the development of the activity is really understood and relatable. Basically, is it face valid? By off-site here, we don't necessarily mean actually off-site, but away from the job. So are we asking leaders to focus on their development in a way that takes them out of their day job so much it either feels irrelevant or it causes them to have a hard time succeeding in their current job? This is all about face validity and applicability. So you can think about this part of it as helping the learner, the leader that is developing, understand what's in it for me by putting this effort into whatever I'm doing. What do I get out of it? The third is that mindset, the 2 different parts of mindset, the organizational and the individual. So when you're thinking about the context and what you need to do, is your organization ready? For example, If you're working in a company where you are trying to get leaders to be more innovative and embracing that risk to be able to operate in VUCA better, is your culture really ready to develop to accept that? So are we developing leaders who behave this way, but their managers and their peers are worried or scared when they see somebody acting more entrepreneurial or taking on more risk? So what do you need to do to prepare the organization for the leadership behavior that you need? And along with this is also helping the individuals understand what their mindset barriers are. And this is where individual assessment becomes really important, helping people really understand what makes them tick, how they're perceived, how the behaviors that they think are successful, or where they may not be successful. And the first is again the metric, or the fourth is the metrics, and that ties back to the first in the context. Define those measures, the things that were defined in the context phase. So why are you doing the training, and what is the expected outcome? I recently had a conversation with a former colleague, and she was asking me, well, how do you talk to your leaders about the ROI of the investment they're making in leadership development? And my answer is I don't. Trying to show an actual ROI, the bottom line money that you get from that $12 billion that is invested, is really hard to do. We know that there's a positive impact, but it's intertwined with so many other factors and so many other variables. It's almost impossible, or is impossible, to tease out what is the ROI. So when you're defining the context and defining why you're doing the training, define what you expect from that training. What are the expected outcomes? What are the behaviors that you're going to see change? How do you measure them, and what impact is that going to have on the business? And so instead of the ROI, we call it the ROE, the return on expectations versus the return on investment. So throughout all of this, the content, the decoupling, mindset, metrics, there's one essential ingredient we haven't really touched on yet. And without this ingredient, little will be accomplished. Actually, probably nothing will be accomplished. And that is the personal accountability of the leader, him or herself. That leader who you are investing in, who you are putting through whatever the development program is, without his or her personal accountability, very little is going to happen. There's not going to be much behavior change, and you're not going to get much of your return on expectation. So let's talk a little bit about how we do help ensure creating leadership behavior change and growth. And let's go again through those four different barriers. So thinking about from a context standpoint, regardless of the program, the individual must have an accurate understanding of his or her strengths and weaknesses, combined with an understanding of the behaviors that are required for success in the current context. This requires, again, individual assessment and feedback that is credible and actionable. The person has to understand what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and why it's important to work on what they are working on. And that then leads to an awareness and acceptance of, yes, I need to commit my time to this, and I will be accountable to this. Thinking about the decoupling, once you have that awareness and the acceptance, that leads to belief in whatever the action plan is. Ideally, that leader is included in developing the action plan, but sometimes when you have a larger training program, maybe they can, maybe they can't. But making sure that when they have their awareness and acceptance is going to help them not decouple, not separate from the action plan that is going to help them learn the new behaviors or skills that's going to lead to the behavior change. With this, with awareness and acceptance and an understanding of how the action plan fits into their development plan, you're going to have a much greater sustained effort and accountability. With that individual assessment, you can help folks understand their mindsets, understand what it is about their characteristics, their behavior that may get in the way of their success. So individual assessments we use here is things like 360s, and sometimes partnering them with personality assessments so people really understand what their behavior is and the why behind it. And again, without this understanding of myself and my mindset, I'm really not going to understand how the action planning is going to really impact me and how I can make it most effective. And then the last is again, a lack of measurements. Whatever I'm doing from a development standpoint, the individual development plan and the behaviors need to be well defined and define what it is going to look like when it's successful? How is it measured? What's the impact? And how do we show that from an objective standpoint? So now let's discuss some at those different levels. Let's discuss some common programs and examples of how we've overcome these challenges in different situations. So thinking about the individual contributor, at this level, development programs are going to tend to be more programmatic and more self-directed. A challenge here, especially for that individual assessment and feedback, is that we're dealing with large numbers. It's difficult to get accurate, specified individual feedback when we're dealing with large numbers. It's hard to have a coach, say, for every individual contributor in your organization. These large programs and the systems that support them can fall prey to a check-the-box activity mentality, kind of a lack of proactive engagement. Yeah, I'll check that box. HR told me to do it, so now they're off my back and moving on. So when we see these programs successful and a way to measure that, what we want to look at is the achievement on the specific development goals of the individual contributor, their individual performance on their normal KPIs, and are they ready to be promoted? Are we helping that person be ready to move to that next level? So an example of a program I was involved with where we were working with individual contributors, especially around getting them ready to be promoted, I was working with a client, and we focused on the performance management program. We redid their performance management process to include an individual development plan for every leader, or for every individual contributor. And in doing so, we were able to tie their development plan to that next level up in the organization. The way we did that is through the LMS, made it very easy to see the behaviors and skills that were required to be that first level supervisor. The individual contributors who were motivated and self-accountable to get there could build their own path. And a really key important component to this was we trained all of their leaders to be better coaches. So for the individual feedback and assessment piece, the process facilitated it, and their manager was then held accountable in their KPIs for developing their talent. And by doing this, we saw a larger number of ready now leaders at that individual contributor level. So moving up a level in the organization, thinking about the corporate leader, typically these are still highly programmatic and system-driven processes. This is also a place where we start to see the more targeted individual development programs and specialized assessment and feedback, more individual attention, especially on folks who may be identified as high potentials. And what we look at here from a behavior change metrics, again, is the achievement of their specific development goals and their individual performance KPIs, but also then how is their team doing? Are they actually acting as a better leader and getting more out of their team? And are they more promotable? Are there more folks in this group that are ready to be promoted more quickly? So an example of this is at that same company where we focused on the individual contributors, we also focused on the corporate leader level. And we created looking at the context of finding what's needed for leadership now. In the new context, we created a spaced out training program, leadership development program, with a very specific change management communication around it of why this was important, how it tied in. That tied into their performance management metrics as well. But we also then identified a group of high potentials. And there had been a high potential program at this corporation, but one of the mindset barriers at the corporation was it was very good old boy. The favorite sons, not a whole lot of daughters, got promoted into the high potential program. So we worked with the leaders to define what potential looks like at the corporate level, leadership level. And then we defined a 360-like process to assess those people that were nominated for the high potential program before they would actually be invited to it. We had an objective assessment of are they showing the behavior on the job that we've defined as potential to kind of break through that corporate mindset, that good old boy ideas. And the end result was we had a much more diverse group, and when we measured the number of Ready Now leaders, we were actually accelerating the development of those leaders more quickly than had been done in the past. So moving up to the next level, looking at the executive, the programmatic kind of the ongoing supported by your LMS kind of goes away here. This is much higher touch, and it becomes much more focused. Successful executive development programs are going to require the support of the C-suite. Executives are extremely busy. They have a lot of competing agendas, and they have their own agendas. So without the executive sponsorship and kind of the tension from the C-suite saying this is important, your executive development programs are going to be less successful. These include a heavy dose of individual assessment, like 360s and personality assessments. And one thing that you can do that's really effective with these kinds of programs is not just look at the individual data and individual development plans, but also looking at the aggregate data. What are the big common challenges across the executive team where you can invest money and get even more bang for your buck along with the individual development? So an example of where I've worked with a client with this, it was a large retailer, about 4,700 locations across the country. They had a new CEO who was really intent on driving a new culture, being more innovative, creating more kind of connection with the client and the customer. So I worked with the CEO and the C-suite to define what was needed in behaviors at the executive level, so the folks that were reporting to the C-suite. We defined that, then we assessed each of the executives. There are 27 vice presidents. We assessed each of them using 360 and personality assessment, and each of them had their individual goals. And we had IDPs that we measured the results of the changes of their behavior. But more importantly, the metrics that we set up also looked at the business outcomes of the business units that those vice presidents were in charge of. And so we looked at that and said, with this new culture, with this new strategy, we expect these numbers to move. And do they move or not? Is the leadership development program helping move these bottom line numbers? And that then led the CEO to have a lot of really important information of the right structure for the company, the right people, and the right job. At the last level, the senior executive, so talking about the C-suite, the focus here tends to be more on executing strategy and, really importantly, working together as an effective team. Making sure that the executives' personal agendas are not impeding the performance of the organization and communication and collaboration with the other members of the C-suite. Typically, we're looking at metrics that are measuring accelerated strategic execution, and when you're doing this, you're also helping avoid those big organizational missteps that can have a large impact on the organization. So a company that I worked with, an example of this is I worked with a company, a large $5 billion logistics company. Their CEO, founder, while he was there was a lot of alignment with the C-suite. They understood the strategy, they executed the strategy, and there was a lot of collaboration amongst the C-suite. The CEO retired, and a lot of that fell apart. There were two divisional presidents reporting to a new CEO, and there became different camps. The teams got misaligned. The strategy was unclear, and this started to pretty quickly impact the bottom line of the business. And this forced the CEO, the founder, retired CEO, to unretire. And when he came back, we worked with him and the chief human resource officer to really define what the expected leadership behaviors were with the leaders, less around competencies and more around the team dynamic and what they were trying to achieve from a strategic standpoint. We call these the leadership imperatives. So once we defined those, although the senior executives went through a 360 and personality assessments again, and they had their personal feedback and IDP plans, but also there was the aggregate data that was then used to help understand where the tensions were in the team dynamic and shine a bright light on them and address them. And with this intervention and the CEO coming back, after 2 years, he was able to re-retire and the organization kept running. So those are 4 examples of kind of typical programs and how to overcome some of those 4 barriers. The importance of individual assessment and feedback and the action planning really can't be understated in the execution of those programs. Here at 3D Group, we focus on 360-degree feedback. And here's some quotes from some of our clients. And I think the quote in the upper left-hand corner, additional input to help drive targeted development, is really germane to this conversation. You heard mention of using other tools too. I think 360s are really important because it gets you a look at what is actually happening. How is this person actually behaving? And you see it from all facets. Combining that with things like assessment center, with personality assessments help the individual understand the why behind the behavior. So a lot covered there in a short amount of time. If there's one thing that you take away today, it is the importance of the individual's personal accountability and leadership development. By removing those barriers and facilitating that, you are going to have a much larger return on expectation, much more change behavior on the job that leads to what needs to happen in your leadership development programs. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here and your time, and now we're going to open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you, Charles. So we did have some good questions that came in. Feel free to enter more here as we talk. So when you're thinking about developing leaders at your organization, where do you start? What's the first step?
Great question. It's really the old Covey saying, you're starting with the end in mind. What is it that you're trying to achieve? Why? And it's all about that context barrier. What is it we need to achieve from a strategic and operational standpoint? What are the behaviors that are required for that? Is the organization ready for that? If not, what do we need to do to make it ready? And then building the program that teaches the new behaviors and the new skills.
Okay, so this question just came in. What are some key factors to look for in identifying potential leaders with a strong sense of personal accountability?
Oh, great question. I think that it's really transparent and really straightforward. Is, do they take ownership of their own job? Are they accountable to themselves and to the team members without their manager forcing them to be that? You can look at potential, and by definition, potential is not something that you can develop. It is something that is there that then you develop from. And so looking for folks who are self-accountable, bring out the best in other people, keep their commitments to others, own up to their mistakes, and really subordinate their personal agenda to the agenda of their team or their company.
Okay, thank you. The next one is, how does Agile help in leadership development? Should leadership development be more pull than push?
I'm not sure I understand the pull than push, but the Agile component of it, I think it plays a big part into it. So the idea that I have a development plan at the beginning of the year, and as the year goes on, the context may change. What I need to perfect, where the skills I need to grow, the behaviors that I need to grow, the challenges that I'm facing may change. So does the process, whether it's with my coach, with my manager, how I'm being assessed, how I'm being given feedback, does it adapt as the context changes? I think it's an incredibly important component to effective leadership development, and something that a lot of companies struggle with.
Okay, Samuel, feel free to chat in and clarify if you have more to your question. I'll go ahead and take the next one. What are the best methods to identify gaps in experience within a department or organization?
If I were looking at that, I think before trying to identify the gap, it's really defining what is required for the job, going back and looking at the basic success profile for the job. So what are the behaviors? What is the experience in the background of those folks that are successful in the role, and creating your benchmark that you then can look at the individuals in the roles. One caution about looking at experience, it should be less about the number of years or amount of time spent in a certain area to get the experience, and what is the expected outcome of that experience? What is the behavior or the skill or the ability that experience provides, and assess that. That way you can make sure you're really getting the best person into that role or into the leadership development program versus just somebody who's kind of paid their dues and earned their time.
Okay, so this next one, I think we've done a whole webinar about, but someone asked, I'd be interested to hear about best practices for developing a program to identify and develop potential leaders. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think that it all starts with defining what is potential. And there is a lot of research out there that shows there's some kind of common themes around what is potential, the ability to learn and think critically, the ability to get along and build relationships, all of those things that kind of go into emotional intelligence. And I think a really critical component is how are you identifying those folks? So in my experience working inside organizations, a lot of times HR will put a call out to leaders and say, who are your high potentials? And I really think that has a lot of challenge and risk with it. Asking a business leader who may be an expert in operations or sales or accounting to identify potential is really a big ask. It's not what their expertise is. And it also is going to help just continue a lack of diversity and good old boy networks that exist, and that this person looks like me and acts like me, so they must be high potential because of course I am. So how defining the potential, but then also as objectively as possible assessing the pool of candidates against that metric. Another important component of high potential programs is when you identify the person is that they're nominated, but they're not necessarily accepted, and making sure that they check the other boxes that it takes to warrant the investment in that development. So that might mean if your high potential is going to need to relocate, is this person willing to relocate? And if not, when might they be? Because there might be reasons that they can't now, but they'd be willing to in a few years. And just, are they willing to put in the extra time? Because there's going to be extra commitments, but they're still going to have to do their day job. So making sure that once they're nominated, it's almost an application process versus a nomination process.
Okay, so Samuel, who asked the question earlier around Agile and whether or not leadership development should be more pull than push, wrote in and said, individuals are now showing that they want customized learning. We also know from Khan Academy that people want to learn at their own speed. So why do we ignore all the research when it comes to designing learning activities for employees? What are your thoughts about that, Charles?
I think you ignore it at your own peril. I think that you have to take into account that's kind of that decoupling piece of the barriers, is making sure that the content of the training and the structure of the programs engages the leaders and keeps them engaged. Where there may be some rub of learning at your own speed or learning what they want to learn, helping them understand what's in it for them if they do participate. Why is this going to make them a better leader? How is this going to help them in their role? But also, if somebody doesn't want to participate, if somebody's not going to participate, that may impact their career. Make sure they understand that, and maybe they don't participate. This also comes back to the individual component of development. When you do the individual assessment and feedback, and that would include things like 360s, that would also include the manager's conversation of what do you want to do? What's your aspirations? Where do you want to go? And helping that person define that path that's good for them, but also good for the organization. There has to be an overlap there. But I do think if you ignore that, the individual side of it, you're gonna miss that individual accountability, and it's gonna be a waste of money.
Okay, thank you. So the next question was, could you talk about some ways to accelerate leadership and self-awareness for business leaders, and what's the most effective leadership development technique, if you could boil it down?
Well, the second part of that, I'm sure that we could probably fill a whole conference with a lot of academics arguing about it. So I think the difference between an accelerated development program and the standard one is just the intensity and the targetedness of it. Beating the drum of individual assessment, again, is making sure people really understand their strengths and development, and nothing beats development. Nothing beats feedback for development. Making sure that those folks that you're paying special attention to are getting a lot of feedback, are internalizing, understanding it, taking action on it. And feedback isn't just where you need to get better, but it's also where you're doing well. From a best way to develop, if I remember the question right, and Jesse, correct me if I'm wrong, it was the best way to develop, or was it the best way to assess?
How to accelerate leadership and self-awareness, and the most effective leadership development technique.
I think the most effective leadership technique is a mixed bag of things. There is no silver bullet. So it's assessment that helps people understand how they're being seen. It's assessment that helps them understand why they behave the way they behave. So like a 360 mixed with something like the Hogan Personality Inventory. And again, the kind of constant feedback and understanding of how their behavior is impacting how they're perceived and their effectiveness.
Okay. So the next question is, how can we help leaders view changes in their professional behaviors as time savers and not just one more thing to do?
That is a common theme in executive coaching is being able to manage time and prioritize. I don't know if there is a one special trick, but it goes back to defining the context of what needs to happen and the importance, and showing the leader how they are behaving versus what the optimal behavior is, and what the downside for them is if they don't. There's some sales here, and any of you have worked in sales forces and the sales training, sales is all about creating some worry and concern in the buyer. So are they worried or concerned that they're not going to continue to be successful if they don't change? And do they see the value in changing? So it's not all fear. There's also the plus side of it. But you have to hold the mirror up to them and show them this is how you're behaving, and it's not optimal. And what do you think the best idea for changing here is, and help them self-discover it. It's a really common problem, a challenge that we see in leaders.
Okay, so the next question is, thanks for all the great questions, everyone.
Absolutely.
What's the next frontier in developing customized learning and getting away from the throw-them-all-in approach to learning that hasn't worked well?
I don't know. It's interesting that with learning, there's been I think self-directed learning is always a good option for folks. The individualized component, depending on the level of the organization, there's been a big push for a number of years for more virtual training. Getting that to be sticky and actually cause behavior change is hard. So if you are trying to leverage technology instead of classroom training and throwing them all in together, thinking about the components of adult learning and change that work with technology versus those that don't. For example, knowledge acquisition and just learning facts and ideas and concepts, that can work pretty well with technology. I still haven't seen a great way of doing the skill practice and the skill building using technology. That I think still requires kind of in-person role playing and practice. And I do think that one place that is really important, and it comes down to the metrics, is measuring the transfer from the hypothetical in the classroom or the coaching conversation to the job. So how is this going to show up on the job? Are we measuring what needs to be measured and giving the person feedback on that? In terms of kind of what's the next new thing from training techniques or technology, that's not my wheelhouse. Sorry.
Okay, so the next question is, should the top-down leadership development approach be replaced with a more inclusive, bottom-up agile approach, in your opinion?
Well, my opinion is I think that they need to work together. Just like any kind of organizational initiative, I think there needs to be the clear marching orders and alignment coming from the top of the organization down, so people understand what is expected and why it's expected, and what it means for them. Then facilitated with that bottom up, and by bottom up, whether you mean kind of self-directed, there's stuff available for me to go get, or something else. I think the combination of top-down, bottom-up together actually can work. I think if you have only one or the other, top-down, it's going to feel like something's being done to me instead of for me or with me. And bottom-up, I think you might risk a real lack of alignment and potential for just some chaos.
Great. So our final question is, how can an organization recalibrate its total reward system to help actualize a leadership development program?
I'm not a comp expert, and it's funny because this has come up with me professionally probably 2 times in the last month of how do we tie professional development into comp. It is really sticky, especially when you get more senior level in the organization where the compensation programs get more complex. I think it comes down to it shouldn't be all of the metric, and the part that comes in is I think a combination of the perceived effort to change, but more importantly, the actual change. Did something actually happen? It's about growth. It's about behavior. Did you see it? Was it on the job? And how do you measure that? And I think it depends on what you're trying to develop. There's an example of that in one of the programs, the individual contributor program that I talked about earlier, is we had the leaders of those individual contributors go through coaching training, how to be a better coach. And then they had a key performance indicator around how well are you developing your talent. So they went to classes, and those who transferred that learning to the job and took it seriously and actually dedicated time and effort to helping their team members develop, they did better on their performance reviews and therefore better on their merits.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Charles. So I think we'll stop there for today, but thank you everyone for your great questions. If you have other questions that didn't get addressed here, reach out to us at 510-463-0333. Check out our website. It's 3dgroup.net. Our next webinar is scheduled for June 7th. Charles will be discussing the use of 360-degree feedback to evaluate leadership development over time. We hope you'll join us then. So thank you again and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.